For most of the 20th century, being in debt carried a kind of stigma. It was something you worked to escape, a sign you had borrowed too much, spent too fast, or fallen behind. But in today's America, especially for people under 40, that stigma has quietly disappeared. Debt isn't a crisis anymore. It's a condition. Student loans, credit cards, car payments, and buy now, pay later installments, each used to serve a different purpose. Together, they've merged into something bigger, a lifestyle infrastructure. Pew Research estimates that Americans collectively owe around $1.6 trillion in student loans. Roughly 1 in 4 adults under 40 carries that debt, and among college graduates, the figure rises to about 1 in 3. The average balance sits between $20,000 and $25,000, according to the Federal Reserve. But that's only the academic layer. Beneath it lies an ecosystem of revolving credit and microloans, from Klarna and Afterpay to credit cards and overdraft lines, that have made borrowing frictionless. For young adults, this is no longer an emergency measure. It's how life gets financed. The problem isn't just how much they owe, it's how normal owing has become. Debt now plays the role savings once did. It fills the space between rising costs, flat wages, and the constant pull of social comparison. It funds education, yes, but also experiences, identities, and appearances. Things that feel essential in a culture where image carries currency. This isn't a story about reckless spending. It's about a generation shaped by systems that made debt the path of least resistance. Education costs outpaced wages, rent outgrew paychecks, financial products removed friction, and social media turned consumption into a performance. Each factor alone seems explainable. Together, they've rewritten the script of financial adulthood, because when everyone around you is in debt, it doesn't feel like failure anymore. It feels like reality. But how did that shift happen? And what hidden incentives made it stick? A generation ago, taking on debt was seen as a temporary phase, something you did to buy a house or earn a degree, then worked methodically to pay off. For young Americans today, that phase never really ends. Debt isn't a bridge to stability anymore. It's the ground beneath it. Consider how the numbers have shifted. In 2004, total US student loan balances were under $400 billion. 2 decades later, that figure has ballooned to roughly $1.6 trillion. According to Pew Research and Federal Reserve data, the median borrower under 40 owes about $25,000, but averages mask the deeper reality. Repayment timelines stretch far longer, and many borrowers juggle multiple forms of debt simultaneously. Credit cards used to be an auxiliary tool, something reserved for emergencies or planned purchases. Today, they function as cash flow lifelines. The Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances shows that nearly 45% of adults under 35 carry a month-to-month balance on at least one card. For many, the balance isn't from a splurge. It's from covering basic expenses between paychecks. This normalization isn't confined to student or credit card debt. Buy now, pay later services, installment options embedded directly into shopping apps, have turned deferred payment into a default behavior. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau reports that among 18 to 24-year-olds, these services now make up around 28% of their unsecured borrowing, nearly double the share seen in older age groups. Debt, once a sign of overextension, has become an assumed backdrop. It no longer signals financial trouble. It signals participation. If you're studying, renting, or simply living in a major city, borrowing is part of the routine. The psychological shift is subtle but profound. Young adults no longer ask if they'll take on debt, only which kind. But here's the paradox. Even though the average balance may appear manageable, its impact compounds quietly. Each small obligation chips away at future flexibility, and what seems affordable now often narrows tomorrow's options. And that's where the next problem begins. Because small debts rarely stay small, what looks like a harmless monthly payment can shape entire life trajectories. At first glance, a $20,000 student loan doesn't sound catastrophic. Compared to a mortgage or a business loan, it seems almost manageable, the kind of sum that can be chipped away with discipline and time. But that logic hides the deeper burden, the way these small balances intersect with stagnant wages, volatile rent, and rising living costs. The Federal Reserve's Survey of Household Economics and Decision-Making, or SHED, shows that nearly 40% of borrowers under 40 say their student debt forced them to delay a major life decision, most often buying a home or starting a family. The median balance, around $25,000, may not look huge on paper, but repayment often stretches over a decade or longer. For many, it's not the size of the debt that hurts, it's its persistence. Interest accumulation turns what should be a temporary burden into a long-term anchor. A borrower paying $250 a month at a modest interest rate may still spend more than 10 years clearing a balance that never seems to shrink. During that time, every dollar directed toward old loans is a dollar not saved for emergencies, investments, or down payments. Even modest debts distort future decisions. They make people cautious, less likely to take entrepreneurial risks, relocate for better opportunities, or pursue lower-paying but higher-growth careers. It's not simply financial drag, it's psychological drag. Carrying debt reshapes how young adults perceive security and risk. It conditions them to prioritize stability over mobility, and in that environment, many turn to short-term credit to plug the gaps left by long-term obligations. A credit card covers groceries when loan payments drain checking accounts. A buy now, pay later plan softens the sting of a necessary purchase. These microloans feel separate, but they're really extensions of the same system. Layers of debt designed to maintain the illusion of financial flow. The result is a generation of Americans managing not one large loan, but a dozen small ones, each individually rational, collectively suffocating. And while many keep up with payments, millions are already falling behind. For them, the cycle starts earlier and ends harsher, because beneath the averages lies a harsher reality. A growing share of young adults are already in delinquency before they've even built a financial foundation. The most revealing statistic about America's debt culture isn't how much people owe, it's how quickly they fall behind. For a growing share of young adults, delinquency isn't a future risk, it's the starting point. According to a CNBC analysis of credit bureau data, roughly 1 in 5 Americans aged 18 to 24 already has at least one debt in collections. That could mean a missed credit card payment, an unpaid medical bill, or a defaulted installment plan. But whatever the cause, the pattern is the same. Financial instability is beginning earlier and lasting longer. What's striking isn't just the number, it's the context. This generation came of age during a period of record low interest rates, unprecedented access to digital banking, and near instant credit approval. In theory, that should have made financial management easier. In reality, it created the opposite. Easy credit doesn't eliminate scarcity, it just postpones its consequences. When you can finance a purchase in seconds, with no credit check and minimal interest, the emotional barrier to spending evaporates. The system rewards immediacy, not prudence. Each delay in payment feels harmless because technology makes it frictionless. Apps send friendly reminders, not warnings. Missed payments don't feel like failure, they feel like a notification you can snooze. But collections agencies don't operate on the same emotional timeline. A few missed payments can quickly escalate into damaged credit, higher future borrowing costs, and even restricted access to housing or employment. By their early 20s, many Americans are already paying what economists call a debt tax, a structural penalty that quietly compounds across years. This is how normalization becomes entrapment. Debt begins as a bridge and ends as a boundary, and once someone's credit profile deteriorates, the financial system doesn't step in to help. It monetizes the risk. High-interest cards, subprime auto loans, and payday lenders become the new safety net. For young adults, it's an early introduction to a harsh reality. The system is designed to lend, not to liberate. But to understand how we got here, we have to look beyond delinquency data and examine the root cause that started this dependence in the first place: the soaring cost of education. The modern debt cycle for young Americans doesn't begin with reckless spending, it begins with ambition. For decades, higher education was sold as the most reliable path to upward mobility, but over time, that promise turned into a business model built on leverage. In 1980, the average annual tuition at a public four-year college was just over $1,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $4,000 today. Yet the actual average tuition and fees now exceed $10,000 per year for in-state students, and more than $27,000 for those attending private institutions. Add housing, books, and living expenses, and the total cost of a degree often surpasses $100,000 before interest. Meanwhile, entry-level wages for college graduates have barely kept pace with inflation. According to Federal Reserve data, real earnings for 25 to 34-year-olds with bachelor's degrees have grown by less than 10% over the past 2 decades, while tuition has climbed more than 150%. The result is structural, not personal, indebtedness. Students aren't borrowing because they miscalculated, they're borrowing because the system demands it. Universities adapted to this new reality with astonishing speed. As federal loan programs expanded, institutions raised tuition accordingly. The availability of easy credit didn't just make education accessible, it made it expensive. In effect, loans became the invisible pricing engine of American higher education. Every new grant, subsidy, or lending expansion indirectly fueled higher costs, trapping students in the very mechanism meant to help them. And for many, debt doesn't end at graduation. It extends into graduate school, professional certifications, and relocation costs tied to job markets that increasingly require degrees. What was once a temporary debt has turned into a lifelong subscription, renewed with each career pivot or economic downturn. But the real shift wasn't financial, it was cultural. Debt stopped feeling like a mistake and started feeling like a prerequisite. In a society where credentials determine credibility, borrowing became the price of participation. And once that mindset took hold in education, it spread, first to consumption, then to lifestyle. Because if debt can fund opportunity, why can't it also fund identity? For earlier generations, financial comparison happened quietly, between neighbors, coworkers, or relatives. Today, it's algorithmic. Every scroll through social media is a curated highlight reel of success, lifestyle, and consumption, often staged, but still powerful enough to redefine what normal looks like. Platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube have turned aspiration into daily exposure therapy. Vacations, designer brands, cars, and apartments become visual metrics of progress. For young adults trying to establish identity and belonging, the message is subtle but relentless. If you're not spending, you're falling behind. The irony is that much of this aspirational lifestyle is itself financed. Influencers promoting luxury goods are often being paid by the very brands they display, and even among regular users, much of that soft luxury comes courtesy of credit. Social media has effectively made status signaling frictionless, while hiding the cost behind aesthetics. Behavioral economists call this social proof distortion, when people overestimate others' prosperity because they only see visible consumption, not invisible debt. The result is a kind of cultural peer pressure that encourages spending to maintain perceived parity, and because digital life is constant, that pressure never really switches off. This is how debt transitions from necessity to identity. The loan for school becomes the credit card for experiences, the buy now, pay later tab for fashion, the subscription for convenience. Borrowing becomes less about need and more about narrative, about staying part of the visual economy that rewards visibility over prudence. But this isn't purely psychological manipulation, it's also technological design. Platforms thrive on engagement, and engagement thrives on envy. Every algorithmic feed rewards displays of aspiration, the very images that quietly encourage users to stretch a bit further financially. The end result is subtle but profound. Debt becomes emotionally justified. It feels less like a risk, and more like an investment in self-image, a rationalized cost of social belonging. And that cultural shift aligns perfectly with the evolution of modern finance. Because just as social media made envy seamless, fintech made borrowing effortless. In the past, borrowing carried weight. You filled out paperwork, waited for approval, and thought twice before signing your name. That friction wasn't accidental. It made debt feel real. Today, that weight is gone. Credit has been redesigned to feel as effortless as a tap on a screen. Fintech companies built entire empires on that psychological shift. Buy now, pay later platforms like Afterpay, Klarna, and Affirm turned the checkout process into a subtle negotiation between desire and delay. With a single click, a $200 purchase becomes $450 payments, interest-free, instant, and emotionally painless. According to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, 18 to 24-year-olds now hold about 28% of their unsecured debt in BNPL accounts, nearly double the share for older adults. The genius of these systems isn't just their convenience, it's their invisibility. Traditional credit cards send you a statement, BNPL apps send you reminders. Debt hides behind pastel interfaces and friendly notifications. You don't feel indebted, you feel empowered. The experience is gamified, not moralized, but the effect is the same. Borrowing expands, only faster and more diffusely. A generation raised on instant approvals and seamless payments begins to see credit not as a decision, but as a default. When every digital product, from phones to concert tickets, offers deferred payment at checkout, restraint becomes the exception, not the norm. Even traditional banks have adapted to this psychology. Instant credit line increases, AI-driven spending recommendations, and mobile wallets that auto-suggest financing options all reduce the friction that once kept debt in check. Each new convenience quietly extends exposure. And it's not just about technology, it's about incentives. Buy now, pay later. Firms make money through merchant fees and consumer data, not necessarily interest, meaning they benefit more when you borrow often, not wisely. The system doesn't profit from your stability, it profits from your repetition. Debt, once a serious financial commitment, has been rebranded as a lifestyle feature, and that rebranding works, because in an economy where wages lag and expenses climb, frictionless credit feels like progress, but convenience hides a deeper vulnerability, the growing gap between what people earn and what modern life demands. And that's where the next chapter begins, with the income side of the equation that debt now fills in for. If frictionless credit made borrowing emotionally easy, stagnant wages made it economically inevitable. For many young Americans, debt isn't a failure of discipline. It's the only way to close the gap between income and reality. The numbers reveal how wide that gap has become. Over the past 2 decades, real wages for workers aged 25 to 34 have barely moved, rising less than 10% after inflation, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But in that same span, the average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment has climbed more than 70%, and the cost of living, especially in major metropolitan areas, has far outpaced paychecks. For earlier generations, wage growth and asset prices moved somewhat in tandem. Today, they've decoupled. A full-time job no longer guarantees financial stability, and side hustles have become survival strategies. In surveys by the Federal Reserve, nearly 40% of young adults say they would struggle to cover a $400 emergency expense without borrowing. That fragility isn't a sign of irresponsibility, it's the outcome of structural imbalance. When essentials like housing, transportation, and healthcare consume nearly all take-home pay, debt fills the gap not as indulgence, but as necessity. Credit cards, buy now pay later apps, and personal loans have effectively replaced savings for millions. Instead of accumulating assets over time, young Americans manage liquidity through debt, a form of synthetic stability that works until it doesn't. It's not about luxury anymore, it's about cash flow management in an economy that punishes pauses, but this coping mechanism carries hidden long-term costs. Each borrowed dollar buys time today at the expense of tomorrow's flexibility, and as balances grow, so does dependence. It's a quiet treadmill, one that keeps running even when you do everything right. And it's on that treadmill that another consequence emerges, one that's reshaping adulthood itself. Because when your 20s and 30s are spent paying down the past, the milestones that used to define progress begin to drift out of reach. For earlier generations, debt was a bridge to the next stage of life, a mortgage for a starter home, a car loan for a commute, or a short-term student loan repaid before the first child arrived. Today, that bridge has become a loop. Instead of financing progress, debt now delays it. The Federal Reserve reports that homeownership rates among Americans under 35 are near historic lows, hovering around 38% compared to over 50% for the same age group in the late 1980s. Student debt is a major reason why. Economists estimate that each additional $1,000 in student loans lowers the probability of homeownership in a borrower's 30s by roughly 1 to 2 percentage points. That's not a temporary setback, it's a structural shift in how wealth accumulates. Delayed homeownership ripples through everything else. Without property, there's no equity growth. Without equity, there's less collateral for entrepreneurship or investment. It's not just about housing, it's about access to leverage, the productive kind. Formation tells a similar story. Surveys show that more than 40% of adults under 35 say financial pressure is a key reason they've postponed marriage or having children. In many urban markets, childcare costs rival rent, and healthcare deductibles can erase months of careful budgeting. Debt magnifies every uncertainty, turning milestones into moving targets. Even retirement saving, once a core marker of financial maturity, has become aspirational. Roughly 2/3 of millennials have less than $25,000 saved for retirement, and many contribute inconsistently to 401ks because of competing loan payments and short-term costs. The compounding power of early investing is lost to the compounding weight of interest. The psychological effect is profound. When stability feels perpetually out of reach, the very idea of long-term planning erodes. Instead, financial focus narrows to the next payment cycle, the next month's rent, the next side gig. Debt reshapes not only balance sheets but time horizons. And when an entire generation's timeline shifts, so does the broader economy. Fewer homebuyers mean slower construction growth. Delayed families mean lower demand in key sectors. The cycle is self-reinforcing. Financial delay becomes economic drag, but behind these personal struggles lies a more systemic story, one that explains why this cycle persists. Because once debt becomes normalized, it doesn't just change individual lives, it changes the incentives of the entire financial system. When debt becomes normal, the economy reorganizes itself around that fact. What began as a coping mechanism for individuals evolves into a business model for entire industries, and over time, into an assumption baked into policy itself. Creditors, fintech startups, and even government agencies have quietly adjusted to a world where borrowing is constant. Lenders now design products with perpetual indebtedness in mind, revolving balances, refinancing options, and graduated repayment plans that stretch over decades. The goal is no longer to eliminate debt, but to manage it indefinitely. In financial terms, consumers have become yield-bearing assets. For platforms, the incentive is equally clear. E-commerce companies earn more when spending feels painless. Payment processors profit when transaction volume grows, not when budgets balance. Even social media algorithms indirectly reinforce the loop. amplifying influencer content that promotes consumption, which in turn fuels engagement, which feeds advertising revenue. This debt in a digital economy isn't just tolerated, it's profitable. Policymakers, too, face a subtle but powerful dilemma. Efforts to reduce student debt burdens or cap credit interest rates can appear fiscally prudent, but politically risky. Entire sectors, from higher education to housing to consumer finance, rely on the assumption that young adults will keep borrowing. Attempts to reverse that pattern risk slowing the very growth metrics that governments depend on. In this sense, the normalization of debt isn't merely cultural, it's institutionalized. The feedback loop is complete. Rising costs drive borrowing. Borrowing fuels demand. Demand sustains prices, and prices justify new credit products. Everyone benefits, except the borrower who never escapes the loop. And yet, this isn't a story of villains. It's a story of incentives. No single actor designed this system, but every actor benefits from its persistence. In a society optimized for consumption, debt becomes the lubricant that keeps the machine running smoothly, which leads to the final question. If debt is now built into the structure of modern life, what does it mean to live wisely within it? It's easy to moralize debt, to treat it as a personal flaw, a lapse in discipline, or a symptom of reckless spending. But the story of modern American debt isn't about character, it's about structure. A generation raised on promises of education, flexibility, and opportunity was handed a system that delivers those things, but only on credit. In this system, debt doesn't signal failure, it signals participation. You borrow to study, to live, to move, to belong. You borrow because the economy rewards access over ownership and experience over accumulation. And when everyone around you does the same, the line between necessity and dependency fades. The deeper truth is that this isn't an accident, it's an equilibrium. High tuition sustains universities. High housing costs sustain asset values. Frictionless credit sustains consumer spending. Every lever of growth depends, in some way, on the willingness of individuals to finance the gap between aspiration and affordability. That's what makes this phenomenon so difficult to reverse. You can't simply tell people to save more when their rent eats half their income. You can't preach financial literacy in a system that runs on debt velocity. The problem isn't that young Americans don't understand interest. It's that they live in an economy where interest is the price of entry, and yet understanding the system isn't the same as surrendering to it. The individuals who thrive within this landscape aren't those who avoid debt entirely, but those who recognize its true cost, not just in dollars, but in time, freedom, and flexibility. Debt can be a useful lever, but only when it serves a purpose larger than lifestyle maintenance. The real lesson, then, is that modern adulthood in America has been quietly rewritten. Independence no longer begins with earning, it begins with owing. And until the underlying economics of education, housing, and wages realign, debt will remain the default language of opportunity. But within that reality lies a choice. To treat debt as destiny, or to treat it as data, to see it not as shame, but as signal, a reminder that a system built on perpetual borrowing can only last as long as people believe it's normal. The first step toward changing that belief isn't to escape the system, it's to understand it deeply enough to stop mistaking survival for success.